So hi everyone, my name is Lech from chocofood.com. You might come across my website. We are doing video tutorials and we have an online store with assets for Blender professionals working in architectural visualization and design fields. And in this short, hopefully 1 hour presentation, I want to show you how to create an interior scene in new Blender 2.8, starting from the scratch. So without much explanation, I will just jump into it. And just to mention, unfortunately, I wasn't able to have the screencast visible in new Blender, so you won't see the shortcuts I'm using, but I hope that's not a problem if we are doing it within 1 hour. Yeah. I don't know if I can change anything here, unfortunately. So, yeah. So I will just start by importing an image to the new Blender, which is a pretty nice feature, if you ask me. And a common problem people have using Blender for architectural stuff is the scale. And the way I deal with it is simply by using the default cube, which is by default has 2 meters, and then I just shrink it to 1 meter. And if you do interior design, you probably know that the door openings have between 90 to 100 centimeters. So doors happen to be in almost every interior, so that's a cool way to very quickly match the scale of your scene to the drawings. So right now I already have it matched, and I will very quickly jump into the modeling right now. Yeah. So I make the gizmo visible. And the modeling, that's another thing that a lot of people tell me that in Blender it's pretty hard to do precise modeling. And as long as I'm doing visualizations, I never had this issue, because if you are just visualizing things, it's not that very often the clients will see 1 or 2 or 3 millimeter difference in, let's say, window size. So I guess I was either lucky not having clients complaining about that, or it's probably not that much of an issue in real life. So I'm just using the E key if you want to know how it's done. E, which stands for extruding. And we'll be visualizing this area, so I will just very briefly go here. And now to match this area, I will just very quickly scale those vertices, add 1 subdivision here, use the snap tool on vertices, and now, unfortunately, this shortcut changed. I will remove doubles, which is under Control V and here. Again, I was pretty complainful about the new shortcuts in Blender, but it's quite easy to get used to them. So I really recommend, because in my opinion, the new version really works well for architectural visualization. If we have, sometimes it's a little bit buggy, like here I was trying to select the face, and what I got selected was the was the edge up here. So if you're working with new Blender, you probably know just entering and exiting the edit mode again usually solves it. So We are almost 5 minutes into the presentation and the Blender crashed. Okay, let's see how, let's see how autosave works. Well, I think it's this file, right? Okay, so we need to speed up a little bit. Yeah, I should be reminded to save more often. So less talking, more working right now. I don't know. Well, was there any save? No, I think that was the most recent one, right?
I think it's because you were in edit mode. If it crashes when you are in edit mode, it doesn't really save.
Okay, let's just spend 2 more minutes and redo it. I think we still...
Maybe you should save now.
Yeah, that's a good advice. I will save. Yeah, let's just go like this. A little shortcut in here. Just very, very dirty here. Oops. Yeah, okay, so we are more or less where we've crashed. So I'll quickly duplicate this face, extrude like this. Okay, and now we save. So now we need to add some height to this interior. Yeah, if you have problem with the grid system in New Blender, which I would like to have 2.5 meters, let's say, in here, or 3 meters, but in case you would like to divide it, now it's here under the grid. I think technically units should also work in here, but I think it's just faster with the grid. So we will add 1 more meter. And now we will cut the window openings. So to do it, I just select everything, deselect the upper edges, and subdivide 2 times. Yeah, that's another feature of the New Blender. So when you have this kind of thing happening, just need to enter and exit the edit mode. So we will have this on 80 centimeters. And yeah, having those images viewed like this, in my opinion, is a really big improvement, because right now I can already see which faces have to be deleted to have the windows. So here we have something like balcony. I'm just quickly deleting those. And I think that's more or less what we need. Now I will very quickly fill those spaces by pressing F. And here. Just the F key. Nothing. No, it's... Yeah, so the interior is more or less where we need it to be. I will create a new collection here called plans, and move the drawing there and make it invisible. So let's now very quickly create the floor, which actually appeared here because I had this collection selected. So again, I'm extending the plane a little bit so we have some ground behind the windows, like this. Sorry. Now very quick subdivision. So normally all those operations can be done pretty much more precisely, but again, we only have 1 hour here. So I'll create some basics shader called plaster and a wooden shader, which will be our floor. I will change the base color to something like this and assign it here already. Should be assigned. Yeah, sorry, I think we need to switch to cycles first. Yes. So I'll quickly copy this color here. Now we visually know what's happening here in our scene. I will duplicate this layer. Delete those edge loops and match the ceiling a little bit more so it doesn't cast any unnecessary shadows. Yeah, so I guess we can work with that from this point. Yeah, thank you for the save tips. We will now add a camera, which, because we have the grid divided here, is a little bit small, same as with the plane. So we need to change the viewport display. I will change the lens to 20 millimeters. Save. Yeah, and I think we can work with a view like that. Another thing I would like to quickly 3D model from the floor plan would be some basic shelves. So I will create one more collection. Let's say it's floor, and just move this object here so we have clean view. Yeah, sorry, it's this one. So we can see the shelves would go in this area here. Yeah, I kind of omitted this area, so sorry for that. The cube. So we will extrude it by 80 centimeters as well. Duplicate it and use the snap tool again for more precision. Extrude again here. Let's say And we can see on the floor plan we have the other shelf starting here with this offset. So quickly adding it to this distance. And repeating it up here. We also have a kind of a desk space in here, so I will just duplicate those upper faces, move them down. And let's say extrude them to 10 centimeters. And here we can also see there is a small offset in this area. So I'll very quickly, I know it's a bit boring right now, but it will get interesting. So with the crash, we're 15 minutes into the presentation, and I would say the molding stage at this point is more or less done. So with unhiding and saving and doing a quick preview rendering on GPU, and this is a very very cool feature, the pixel size, which we can change to 2 and have a much quicker preview. We now have a very dark interior. So by changing the color management a little bit, and without adding any lights, we already have some base to work on. So the next step, I will just add some very quick lights, and to do that, I will. Oops, sorry. Okay. I will very quickly change my viewport. Yeah, okay. So with the camera visible here, I will add a sun object. And thanks to this faster preview, I can basically have a live view on what's happening here in the scene, thanks to, it doesn't have to fully render the border resolution, so that's really handy if you're setting up the lights or materials. And I would like to have this nice smooth shadow here. So to make the interior a bit more brighter, I will just multiply the energy and hide the overlays. And as for the world, which is still non-existent, I will use the black body and set up the color to 7500, so it gives this more neutral white or a little bit cold, you can say, tint to the image. So here we can also play with the exposure to match it the way we want. I will just double check the shadows again. I think it looks decent for 20 minutes. So now we're gonna speed things a lot, I think. So I will start adding the assets, which are already pre-made. But let me do one thing first. This is a pretty cool thing. the collections we have in Blender, we can right now just drag and drop the file, as you can see, and append things by the collection. So all the assets I had on the specific layer, they are added to this layer, which is pretty awesome in my opinion. It really saves a lot of time and work. So we will now very quickly arrange the scene. Some chairs. So you may be wondering, like, what's the purpose of this kind of visualization if it's not within the scale and it's just quick and dirty and it's done very quickly? At least from my experience, there are many projects where before you set up everything very precisely and to the centimeters and millimeters, you would like to see, like, if your idea is even worth the additional work. So if you have a furniture selection, let's say, and a general concept of the interior or a general concept of the, let's say, trade shows, trade stand, you would like to see if the furniture matches the color, if the conceptual lights you would like to have will at least look good enough to develop the project in that direction. So very often some of the companies prefer quick, we call them quick and dirty renderings that can be done very quickly, and so the decisions can be made very quickly as well, instead of having this super refined renderings, which then come later. And yeah, I will use those. So we can now have another preview. And I think it's slowly but really getting there. So what I also do here, we'll be adding a little bit more detail to those shelves. We still have almost 40 minutes. So I will very quickly subdivide it. Now I will duplicate those, separate the selection. Yeah, and delete the edge loop here. Now select every second face in here. Press Y key to separate them from each other. And now I will use the individual origin here and scale everything, scale everything in the x-axis like this. So we have this little offset, and now just extrude them. So this is a quick way to add this, I think, important details, so the whole image doesn't look that flat and uninteresting. So what we still miss is the floor and something to put here. So now I will very quickly jump into the quick shader preparation. And this new viewport here comes very handy in my opinion. So I will go to the maps, which I already have prepared. And I think it's a cool method to have as much one from a single texture as you possibly can, is separating the RGB channels out of it. So I don't want to get too much into the theory in here, but each color channel for any JPEG looks a little bit different. And when you prepare the roughness or the bump maps, they are usually just the black and white images. So instead of preparing 3 different textures which have to be loaded to cycles every single time, we can just use this node that separates those 3 channels. And if we, let's say, plug them to the roughness, we can have different looks every single time. And then to fine-tune those effects, I'm using the color ramp node, which allows me to, as you can see, make the roughness values, yeah, you know what I mean, you can see it. So the black color stands for perfect reflections. To change it, I will just make it more gray. Same with the white. White stands for perfect 0 roughness reflections. So I just go more to the gray tint. And I'm not super happy with this look, so I will just see how it looks with different color channels. Yeah, I think maybe the green one was the best. I think we could go with something like this. So once I have my roughness set up, I just disconnect it and then add a bump node. So I work on each one of those effects separately. So I'm not getting confused with what I'm actually editing at the moment. So right now I know I'm just editing the bump values. So I can decrease the strength a little bit. Now I can add the roughness, which I already set up. And now the last step is just adding the color. And with the roughness, I forgot to mention one thing. To edit this setting right now globally, I can just make it, like change the value of it. So I simply add a hue saturation node and play with the value. So let's say I want to make it more glossy, then I just decrease the value, which multiplies what I've already set up here. So I think this looks better, maybe too much. Yeah, and I will just decrease the bump a little bit. Decrease the saturation, tint, and I would say, yeah, the material is more or less ready. I will only change the UV a little bit, so we have more repetition visible. Yeah. So now when I preview, texture is already visible. I think I need to rotate it. So I will do it here. And one thing missing is the window, which I looks like forgot to save to my asset library, but I will find a quick solution to that. So I have my Choco 4 models available. We created an asset manager for Blender 2.79, which unfortunately doesn't work with the new Blender yet. And this whole library can be browsed within the Blender 2.79. But now I can just check the renderings, let's say the model 22, and without much problem, just drag and drop it to our new Blender, like this. So I just choose the object, and it's visible here. So let's see how it works. Some of the objects I already have prepared with the shape keys, which allow me to, let's say, with the shutter to roll them. But we will keep it like this, maybe move it a little bit more to the interior. So I think we are almost there. One more preview, 30 minutes into the presentation. Yeah, and we will try to render it, and within those 5-10 minutes, if you have any questions, so it's not that. Would there be any questions? Because if not, then I could just use some pre-rendered frame and show you the post-production techniques I'm using. But if there are any questions, we can just let it render for around, I think, 8-10 minutes. So would anyone have any questions? No? Okay, so if there is one question, I will just keep talking. It's now 30 minutes, so I think the other presentation is ending. We will just see, okay. One more thing I like to set up just before we let things render is the sun temperature as well. So again, I'm using just the black body object, black body node here. And set it up to, let's say, 4000. So it adds a little bit warmth here, and we have this sky kind of cold tint of the light here. So I think it can go like this. The render settings and cycles, at least for me, are quite simple. We will use a bit smaller resolution, so 72p, 720p. As for the performance, I'm usually setting the tiles to 400, depending on the resolution, but that's more or less the tile size that works best for me. As for the light paths, I usually increase the diffuse and glossy bounces to 6. Disable caustics. Set the sampling to, let's say, 1000 something, and clamp both direct and indirect bounces a little bit, and of course enable the denoiser. So just double checking if everything is set up, and I think we can let it render. So we are 35 minutes, including the crash, into this scene, and I think it's not bad. I think it's going there. So the render time is supposed to be around 5-6 minutes. I think we can do Q&A right now if you're interested. And the mic is here, so.
So the first question, this project you put into the background for the first time, it was image or it was just empty? Or
I think in new Blender, it will go a little bit slow because it's rendering, but okay, it should. Yeah, so the image we had as a kind of background here, I think in new Blender it's an empty object,
okay,
which also has some properties like opacity and so on visible here. I will just save.
Maybe it's just a newbie questions, or I don't know if it's new in the 2.8 when you selected all the walls to make the subdivision for the top on the bottom of the window, and then you deselected the top on the bottom and made subdivide. But
yes,
it was fast, so I didn't see if because you were selecting vertices and faces in the same time, or?
No. Usually when I do the subdivision for the window openings, I just select the vertical edges. Somehow in new Blender, if you want to select them, they just don't select. So I selected everything and deselected the upper and the bottom ones. So the middle edges were selected, and then I subdivided them.
Okay.
I can show it again if it's necessary. It's not that hard. Maybe let's just let it render for those 2-3 more minutes. I think there was one more question in the back.
Yeah, when you appended your objects, you had to go in and choose some object, or was it a collection you chose?
So the file I had, there were those 3D models present in this file, and you can still append the old way. So let's say just drag and drop the file, click append, and then select the particular objects you just want to be appended.
Okay, so you browsed the appended file, not the actual file you're working on. If that makes sense. So when you appended, you browse the file that you append for the actual objects you want to append from that file. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
No, the thing is, I just usually store the files I want to be appended from that single file. Let's say if it's a chair, I would like to have it just as a one object in one file. In that case, just to save the clicking and everything, I just put multiple objects into one file, and I appended everything just by dragging and dropping it. If that makes sense, the answer.
Yeah, thank you.
And in general, do you leave the windows empty, or do you have a nice glass material to show?
There is a glass kind of a trick that I'm using, and I think we will have a few more minutes after the rendering is finished. So I will show you how I do the windows. I will just note it, okay?
Thanks.
Someone else?
Actually, it was a question related to asset, but could you tell more about the asset and object library so you can speed render your interior design?
Can I tell more about the...
how you're using assets and how you're building your libraries with assets?
So I don't want to advertise that much during the conference, but the Choco4 website is basically both a tutorial part and a store part. In the store, I'm just selling the assets that you can see in this presentation. And the way I'm building up this library, I'm working with interior designers. We are not able to like randomly model infinite amount of models, so we just handpick the ones we like and just put them to the library. And the way we prepared for Blender is, do you want to know the technical part, how we do it?
I'm actually curious because this is kind of important in other businesses.
So for Blender pre 2.8, we created an add-on that used the file structure you can see in here. So we had blend files. Each one of those files has usually just a one model, or if the model comes in pairs, let's say as the birds you can see in here, then we add a multiple objects. And then we have this little structure here with maps, which contains all the maps for all the objects from this category. So let's say we have details. The details are just cataloged the way like doors, decoration, stuff like this. So in curtains, we just keep the curtains, and the renders just are also in one folder. So the names are the names match the files. This is the way we had to do it for our asset manager, which I think I can show how it works in the old Blender. I will just save this rendering. I will still color correct it in Blender a little bit, but I will just answer this question by showing the our model manager in the old Blender. So this is it's called Choco4 Model Manager. The way we did it was like that. So you had those foldable categories here, and then you could choose from the subcategory what kind of model you'd like to use. Let's say the fashion models are shoes and this kind of stuff, and just by clicking the button, the models were imported to the scene. But as I mentioned, we had to keep this file structure to make it working, and I think that this file structure is pretty good in general for keeping your files organized, because now for the new Blender we can still just use this renders catalog to very quickly navigate and find what we need. And the library already has over 1,200 models or something, and it's really still very quickly to find what we need this way. Okay, so yeah, I think we have pretty decent picture right now. I will just try to fine-tune it a little bit in here in the color management. I'm just a bit afraid that it crashes, but I will try to do it like this. And I'm a bit afraid it might not be fully visible on the beamer, but yeah. So so as you can see, we can play with the exposure here. And I'm usually using gamma value usually it should be used 2.2, but I think the image is a little bit too desaturated, or it has too little contrast. So just by dropping it to, let's say, 2.0 or 1.8, as I said, there might be not much difference visible in the beamer, but let's just keep it by 2. Okay. So I save the image one more time. And unfortunately, for post-production, I'm using Photoshop. Mainly because we still have 15 minutes. I can show why, because I'm not that big of a fan of the Blender curves. I know the update here, it's still not instant, and it will probably be in the final release, but I'm not that, I don't know. Those handles don't work the way I'm kind of used to in Photoshop. So that's why I just usually drop my images or render outputs to Photoshop and quickly process them here. So the first step in my post-production, those steps are, I would say, 99% of the time the same. So I play with the exposure. I'm just checking if it's visible. Yeah. So I'm adjusting the exposure by adding a few steps up. Then I adjust the curves to get a little bit more contrast. And I think, yeah, I think those lower values just somehow I'm not able to get this nice contrast in dark areas with the Blender curves. I don't know what's the reason. Maybe someone knows. But these are usually the two steps I start with. So we get more, I don't know, more depth. It's pretty hard to determine if there are any rules for post-production. Let's say the color balance thing is very subjective in my opinion. So there isn't, at least for me, any rule that I'm using when doing the color balance thing. But a general rule that could be kept is, let's say if we, like you can see this image is more into the warm and yellowy and a little bit red tones. So using the color balance within those tones usually gives the, maybe not the best, but usually it gets the good result. Instead of moving to, let's say, I will just show it. Instead of moving to those artificial, like very cold colors, if we just continue into this warm idea we had from the beginning, it should be fine then. And very often my workflow is just using the sliders and looking at the image, not at the values. So as long as I feel it looks good, I think it looks good. One of the things I'm using quite often is adding a blue tone in the highlights. So it doesn't make the image cold, but I think it adds something to the light, some more realistic tone. So I don't know if it's that visible in the beamer. Usually the last step is just the selective color thing, and I'm again not pretty sure if there is a Blender compositor tool or node that's relative to this one. This tool allows me to change the tones just of the specific color range. So right now we have the reds, and as you can see, only the red tints are affected. And very often what I added are just the reds and yellows. So as you can see, just by increasing the cyan, this whole area here gets a little bit desaturated. Yeah, since we don't have many greens and blues and magentas in the scene, I will just jump into the whites. With this black value, you can increase the general brightness of the image or make it darker in the higher tones. But I usually just keep it as it is, maybe slightly adjust it. And you can also add the blue tones here. So I will just exaggerate it, again, just 20%. And the neutrals, I usually just crunch them a little bit so we get this little contrast in mid-tones. And if I like the effect in general, but then I turn it on and off and think it's a bit too much, I just decrease it by percentage here. Save it as a group. Sorry. And when you do this post-processing step by step, those little layers seem not to change the image that much, but once you add them all together and turn on and off, I think the difference can be seen. So yeah, we are 50 minutes into the presentation. The image is rendered. It's maybe not super high resolution, but I guess you can already use something like this to tell your client what your idea was. And I think it's a pretty nice quality of a rendering, and it was all done in Blender. So I think, and it's all done in Blender 2.8, so I think it's already a capable tool, even though it's still in alpha phase. I think it can be used for professional work. I mean, I'm using it. So there was one question about this subdivision, right? I will just show it just on the cube. Oh, sorry, again, the collection thing. So, normally in old Blender, I would just press B and select the edges, but yeah, I think it's still kind of not working in the new Blender. I just select everything, and then with the middle mouse button, select the upper and the lower edges, so I have the selection here, and then just subdivide it by 2. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's maybe maybe it should be reported. Okay, so I guess yes, the glass thing. Sorry, thanks for reminding me. Yes. Normally, if I put the curtains in the windows, I don't use any glass objects between them to make the calculations a little bit faster. But if I use them, I will just use a very primitive glass here. So let's just focus the cursor on selection. When I do the glass objects, I always try to make them physically correct in terms of geometry. So if it's a glass, it should have some thickness. Just the way cycles work, I think this is the best way to do it. Usually the glass shader that's available by default does the trick. But the way I do it is, it really depends. If it's a glass on the object that needs to have those nice reflections, like let's say this flask of water here, I just use the principled BSDF. But since the windows, they don't really have that much of the refraction, and we want to see what's behind them and have some reflections like we usually have in the glass, I'm using just this basic node setup, which is just the transparency plus the glossiness, which I mix. And then to simulate this Fresnel effect, I'm using the layer weight here. And you can use either, again, a color ramp node here, or you can use the RGB curves, which I prefer using the curves here. So I do something like this, meaning the more angle I have looking at this object here, the more reflections will be visible. So let's see if we make the transparency. Yeah, if we reduce the transparency, you can still see we have the reflections visible, and by increasing those curve handles, we get more reflections. So it's a glass that actually looks like a glass. It's a little bit fake, but one of the problems I have with glass in cycles is that, as you can see here, there is no shadow continuing, I think. And the way I deal with it is when you go to the object settings, and here you have the cycle settings. So I usually disable the shadow. As you can see, it now appears in here. You could also do it with the light path nodes, but you have to add them and do this again node setup here. I just prefer disabling again diffuse, because as you can see, when the diffuse is enabled, then it blocks the diffuse path from being calculated here. In the end, what I only leave enabled is the camera and glossiness. So there is a little bit, something not fully physical happening here. So maybe it really depends again on the scene. If I'm, let's say, happy with this kind of result, I just leave the diffuse switched on. If I'm not, then I switch it off, and yeah. But this kind of glass, I think it's professionally called thin glass material. It's kind of problematic for the GPU render engines. It was problematic for Octane as well for quite a long time. So this is the way I use it in cycles. So I guess we are having 2 more minutes. So I want to thank you for being here, and I hope it was interesting. Maybe a bit boring through the modeling part, but I hope it was informative, and and you're happy with your time spent here. Thank you.